both players here. 2-1 in their pot. It was a three-way tie between the two of them and Jeremy Bertarioni. They actually just faced off last round.
Yeah.
Joe was the winner there, looking to make it 2 in a row against Edgar.
Look, at this point, they're really just fighting for their tournament life. Every single win matters.
You see Gilded Goose to start out for Edgar. So I know you played some of this deck in Standard. Do you have a feel? What are we looking for
Trail
in
of
this?
Crumbs. Trail
that
of
was
Crumbs
fast.
Is the card. Because what that does is it lets you dig towards more synergy pieces, right? Things like Witch's Oven, Cauldron Familiar, Mayhem Devil. These are all good cards, but they are good with other pieces. They want you to have other things. Whereas Trail of Crumbs, if you just play cards, you'll get around to doing things. And we see Edgar just breaking out ahead here. So he has this Gilded Goose, turn 2, Beanstalk Giant, going on an adventure to put him up even more mana here. This is just kind of the early phases of creating as much material on the battlefield as possible.
Yeah, both players with the Witch's Oven all set up here. Yeah, in this kind of matchup, does the second half of Beanstalk Giant matter much, or is this really just a rampant growth?
Well, the second half of Beanstalk Giant can be 2 food.
Okay. All right, but that's what we're looking at.
Right.
And Joe first out with a Mayhem Devil. In this kind of synergy mirror, that does feel like a card that's going to matter.
Oh, it's a very big deal. Get this. Mayhem Devil sees your opponent sacrifice things.
I don't want to play this mirror against either of these players. Oh, my goodness.
So all of a sudden you have situations where sacrificing food to Gilded Goose, that's a trigger.
So when that triggers, in the case of opposing Mayhem Devils, the person whose turn it isn't pings first.
It's this whole thing. They all go on the stack, but then the others resolve first.
Oh, goodness. The player whose turn it isn't, those pings resolve first.
However bad this sounds to you, it is that bad.
Yeah, this is one of those things, if you play it on Arena or Magic Online, you just kind of sacrifice stuff and then you watch a whole spew of boxes show up on the screen and you figure it out.
Lots of fwish sounds.
Yeah.
All kinds of things.
Edgar with 3 mana up. So Mayhem Devil will attack in. Edgar down to 14. Or 15, rather. And we see on Joe's side.
And we see a Murderous Rider hanging out in Edgar's hand here. Him not going after this Mayhem Devil is likely him trying to save it for something like Korvold instead. That's the card that can actually just slam the door shut out of nowhere. And we see Lossett with a Fabled Passage, going ahead, sacrificing it, sending a point at the Gilded Goose, trying to kind of make those exchanges that you mentioned earlier, where he's trying to reduce what Edgar has access to on the battlefield.
So Thrashing Brontodon from Joe, that's going to take care of Edgar's Witch's Oven.
Ooh, and this is a big swing because this gives him that second ping on Gilded Goose.
Okay.
So this is a spot where Edgar's just going to be set back to the point where he's not going to have anything on the battlefield anymore. At this point, probably thinking about firing off Murderous Rider just to go ahead and use his mana efficiently. It's very rare that running out of cards is the squeeze you're put in with this deck.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that. You know, you have this 3 mana 3/4, and you're willing to spend all 4 mana just to remove this 1 mana Witch's Oven?
Well, the thing is if Edgar doesn't have a Trail of Crumbs, that's a perfectly fine use of it. This Witch's Oven is going to be quite valuable over the course of the game.
So we see a sacrifice of Witch's Oven for some food from Joe. That's in response to the removal spell. So board is kind of clear now with 2 ovens. Yeah, checking there. Thrashing Brontodon did take care of Edgar's Oven.
Right.
Yeah, there's enough triggers here that tracking them on the player side is pretty difficult. But Edgar responding with a Brontodon of his own has the 3/4 in play. And right now, I like this. There is, that we talked about just trade everything that is happening right now. You see both players developing up on their mana.
All right, Korvold, Fey Cursed King, hitting the battlefield.
Korvold is a play, and yeah, Joe now seamlessly making into the high end of his deck. He also has Casualties of War in hand.
Right, so this is the scary part. Korvold is the thing that can apply the most pressure here. This is the kind of card where if Lossett finds something like a Cauldron Familiar off the top of his library, that's just going to represent so much damage between everything you sacrifice.
So whenever you sacrifice a permanent, he will get a 1/1 counter on Korvold and draw a card.
Except for this Casualties of War.
So Casualties of War from Edgar keeps things clean. He wants to control the card advantage from Joe's side. So what's the card then you're waiting for to break this open?
Okay, so at this point, Lossett is actually missing a bit now. That Casualties of War hitting his red source and the Korvold. Like now, Lossett just kind of has to rebuild again and try to get just edge back in with some sort of threat.
Yeah, Casualties of War being the card here for Edgar to get some card advantage. Brontodon going to swing in. Both players now at 14. No one really with a synergy engine going. It's
right.
Turning into this value game.
Yeah, and you really want something like Trail of Crumbs to get you into that value spot, but it looks like neither player can really find anything to keep the cards coming.
And back over to Edgar we go. He has that pressure down with a Thrashing Brontodon. He still has his Beanstalk Giant out on an adventure, and then looks like another Casualties of War in hand.
Speaking of the devil.
Speaking of it, and this is actually interesting with how the game's developing, becoming a lot about these sweepers.
Yeah, and this is just reducing both players' resources back and forth. And Lossett being able to hit that Castle Lochtwain is actually the big win for Lossett here. We saw Edgar pick up a card with it last turn, and that was something where it just threatened to take over the game.
Still managing to make it to 7 mana. Beanstalk Giant does finally enter the battlefield for Edgar.
That card's unbeanable.
Whoa! Yeah, not just 2 food this time. This one actually is going to look like a pretty good beater.
Oh, yeah. Beaner, actually.
Ooh,
Beater,
I like that more.
Know?
Castle Lochtwain is now on Joe's side. He managed to pick one up. But facing down the Beanstalk Giant, his life total is something he has to be careful with right now.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Swing in here. Joe contemplating if he can take damage. 8 lands in play for Edgar.
Yeah, both players flooding out a little bit here. Think of it this way. Both players have resolved Casualties of War. Joe has resolved a couple of them, and there's still, 6, 7 sources of mana on both sides of the battlefield at this point?
Right. It is turning, even though these are synergy decks, they still do play like Jund decks, where it's a bunch of removal trading with cards and turning into a top deck war, where things like a overcosted 7 mana creature might be just fine. It is still a 2-for-1, and back to Joe we go. Looks like he has another Casualties of War in hand. Maybe hoping to get more value out of it than just a 1-for-1. Well, pass. That actually might just be a Fabled Passage. He's got 2 lands, maybe 3. A swing here. Is that just for the whole life total?
Ooh.
It is. We're going to have to sacrifice some food.
Yeah? Okay.
Yeah, and actually the Land Flood on Joe is doing double damage here. 1, it spells he can't cast. 2, it means Castle Lochtwain can't really draw him cards.
Right, a lot of cards in hand, and, Phyrexian Arena gets a lot worse when it costs 4 or 5 life.
Right. Yeah, Joe up to 6. He takes the hit off Beanstalk Giant. One more draw for him. Can he marshal the resources needed here to stay alive? Needs a removal spell. Murderous Rider of his own. Something like that.
Looks like just a bunch of lands in hand, but if you could find something like a Murderous Rider, that might be able to do it.
Yeah, Witch's Oven is the play. Yeah. Checking card count, whether he'd played the land. He had 3 cards last turn, so this still should be good. I believe he still has a land drop that he can make this turn. He had 3 lands in hand last turn.
Right.
Drew 1 card. It was Witch's Oven. This should be good. By the count I have here.
Right, they're just double checking here. There is so much on the line. Want everything to just, be face up on the table.
Right, and I think Edgar, they want to make sure they get this right, especially because of Castle Lochthwain being a card.
Oh, right. It just completely changes the math on things. And, look at the number of black sources that Lossett has. This can be the difference between being able to cast, say, a Murderous Rider that he draws and not. Right. It changes the number of outs that he has off the top of his library.
And both players just confirming on the land count here. And Edgar mostly flooded on his side as well.
Yeah. Yeah, both players, it's a spot where it... on one hand, you want to call it a low-resource game, but both players just have a ton of lands.
Yeah, and that's 3 more. So Joe does play the land, draws, and it's not going to help.
Ooh.
So our first game does go over to Edgar Magalhaes. And in that side, I do like Joe's game plan. It was a lot of trading. This is one of the ways we've wanted him to go about the matchup. At the end of the day, though, he was the player to run out of resources first.
Right, and that's a spot where it kind of felt like he had the beginning pieces of everything he needed. He had Korvold, he had a Mayhem Devil. He was able to take some of Edgar's cards, but, you can only have so many lands come off the top and hope to come out ahead in a grindy matchup.
Yeah, the Korvold had a lot going for it. And I guess, if he really wanted to get fancy, he could wait until he had Witch's Oven with Korvold. But I like actually the way he's running these things out. He's forcing Edgar to have cards. Unfortunately for him, Edgar did have them.
Right, and he even had the Witch's Oven. It just got hit by a Casualties of War.
Right. So we do look over at the sideboards between the two players. This is a mirror, so we're going to expect similar game plans from the two of them. That said, there are some differences in their decks. Both players have some Duresses with some Love-Struck Beasts in the deck, 2 Wicked Wolves. However, for Edgar, he has Massacre Girl and Noxious Grasp, whereas on Lossett's side, he has extra copies of Korvold, an extra... some copies of Deathless Knight. Otherwise, we're looking at mostly a mirror.
Right, and Lossett's list is pretty close to what we saw Peter Glogowski win the Mythic Championship with last weekend. What I would expect in this case is to see things like Thrashing Bronodon come in, because that's something that can check Trail of Crumbs, which is the most important card in the mirror. Maybe some number of Massacre Girl, because that can check things like Mayhem Devil. It's also just kind of a reasonable threat on its own. Ultimately, you're not trying to mess with the formula too much, because what you want to be doing is just building the biggest synergy you can and trying to take over in the face of what your opponent is doing. If Lossett is trying to adopt a more, let's say, grindy angle to things, or just wants to get Edgar dead, we could end up seeing him go into something like a Love-Struck Beast just to be better at applying pressure, or bringing in this other copy of Murderous Rider, and maybe even Wicked Wolf, if he just really wants to go all in on the creature strategy. But you really can only afford to go in so far on this before you just end up behind in a ton of exchanges.
Right, so the concern here is that if this matchup becomes about trading and about more, just a real attrition game plan between the two. These lower impact creatures aren't what you want. You just want standalone good cards. That's why we're looking at things like Wicked Wolf.
Right. And things like Wicked Wolf are going to end up being better in the face of, say, Casualties of War.
Right.
But honestly, if I'm in their positions, I'm looking to sideboard out copies of cards like Murderous Rider because they don't contribute to this big synergy plan and they don't interact with the most important cards. I mean, they hit Korvold, but other than that, you're not really that worried about creatures or planeswalkers. It's things like Trail of Crumbs that take over the game.
Right. So that said, we want to look at some of the cards that are not symmetric in their decks. Do any of those matter here? You know, things like Deathless Knight, Noxious Grasp, or we're just playing a mirror?
Yeah, for the most part, you're really just playing a mirror. Deathless Knight is the kind of card that you're going to want for Temur Reclamation, Noxious Grasp more for the dedicated green Planeswalker decks with things like Nissa, who shakes the world. Duress is something that you could see bringing in against the Golgari Sacrifice deck because it has Planeswalkers. You know, you'll see 6-mana Garruk, you'll see Vraska, Queen of the Golgari. Duress has a lot more play there. But here I think you're leaning into things like Massacre Girl because in so many cases, Duress is just going to miss and you feel foolish.
12 spells on each player's side. I mean, I do like the upside of Duress hitting Casualties of War specifically.
Sure.
But, I mean, outside of that, I don't think it's a very good card here.
Exactly. And really, I mean, it's an overgrown Tomb Mirror.
Right.
Hand destruction generally isn't where you want to be in those matchups because unless you have it in a very specific time frame, your Duress just isn't actually going to hit cards that matter.
So we see Edgar starting here on Gilded Goose.
Honk.
Love the card. As we are underway for Game 2, this is now Joe back against the wall, our defending player's champion here. Loser of this match is eliminated from the tournament. And it's going to be Witch's Oven and a Gilded Goose of his own for Joe. So keeping pace, getting these actually in this matchup, the lower mana cards seem to be more important in the early game.
Right, and because a lot of this is just kind of about mana efficiency and actually getting to just do things every turn.
All right, first card you mentioned, a big one here, is the card Trail of Crumbs.
Let me hit you with a synergy that we are absolutely going to see from Edgar in a moment. All right, float a mana with your Gilded Goose. You know what you do to float that mana? You sacrifice a food. You know what happens when you sacrifice a food?
You pay 1.
Yeah, and you know what gives you 1? This food you just sacrificed.
All right, so you tap Gilded Goose, sacrifice a food, then you get the top 2 cards of your library, and you get a permanent in your hand.
Right.
So you just draw cards?
Oh, if you think Seagate Oracle is a good card, imagine a 1-drop that just does that every turn.
So Gilded Goose now just taps to draw a card.
Yep. And it even lets you pick the cards.
Sounds pretty good. He has to reveal it. It is a permanent cards only. Now, their deck is basically all permanent cards.
Oh, yeah. Look, even the spells are permanent cards because of how Murderous Rider, Beanstalk Giant, Adventures, etc. work.
Now so normally I'd say this is a runaway for Edgar, except Joe has the same synergy going on. So with both players just drawing tons of cards, what starts becoming important now?
So now it just is all about making the biggest synergy and trying to interact with what the opponent is doing in the meantime. Here, you want to try and find something like Thrashing Bronodon that's going to be able to interact and turn off the opponent's Trail of Crumbs so you can just clog the battlefield bigger than them.
Cauldron Familiar from Edgar. And this is one of those things where I think it's a danger because this board is complicating very quickly.
Correct. And the nice thing about Cauldron Familiar, that's just more cards you can draw. Each time you loop it, you get to pay 1 because you sacrifice a food.
Right. But Witch's Oven making a food as well.
Right. So
goodness.
You get to sack the cat and get a food, and sack the food and get a cat, and then pay 1, and look at the top 2 cards, and put 1 in your hand, and then you untap, and then you tap the oven, and you sack the cat, and you... so on and so forth.
I see how this works.
So we see Joe pick up a Mayhem Devil here over a copy of Thrashing Bronodon, and I think that's an interesting decision, but in a lot of ways it kind of turns off Edgar's synergy here. Because now, if Edgar actually uses them very much, then Joe's going to get a bunch of pings out of it.
All right, so Mayhem Devil. In response, with it on the stack, Edgar sacrifices Cauldron Familiar, makes a food. Cauldron Familiar in the graveyard, sacrifices a food. And now that means because he sacrificed a food to Trail of Crumbs, he gets a card in his hand. It's going to be Fabled Passage.
That's a rough land to pick up when the
When
opponent has a
Mayhem
Mayhem
Devil?
Devil.
Yeah.
Mayhem Devil's a nice one.
Familiar back into play. Does Edgar want to goose away the food? No, he does not. Mayhem Devil now on the board. Gilded Goose for Joe. All right, now the ping can start. Goose sacrifices a food. He gets a mana for Trail of Crumbs. He can activate Trail of Crumbs. Shoots 1 damage onto the Gilded Goose. Finds Cauldron Familiar.
With a Witch's Oven and a Mayhem Devil, this might actually just be enough to
Right.
lock things up for Joe.
And he had a green mana floating. Actually,
Looks like it was a
black mana floating.
for
Yeah, exactly. Cauldron
this
Familiar.
scenario.
Really strong play there from Joe. Cauldron Familiar drains for 1. Witch's Oven still untapped. 1 damage on the Gilded Goose. Tap. Witch's Oven. You put the cat into the oven. You get another food, a sacrifice, another ping. Gilded Goose is down. Another food. He can keep going to work. Do you want to still kill the Cauldron Familiar here? Does that do anything?
I think so. It just denies Edgar a food. If you think you're going to end up doing it anyway, at least doing it this way is going to make it so Edgar is down a resource.
And Joe passes. Can do that at any time. Back to Edgar we go. But that Mayhem Devil, when there's a Mayhem Devil on one side and not on the other, this matchup gets very lopsided.
Right, but we also know Edgar has that copy of Murderous Rider hanging out in hand, which is
Right.
going to be huge here.
Right, certainly is ready to shoot down the Mayhem Devil. For Edgar, he's still a good number of lands away from Casualties of War. It's a 6-mana sweeper. And at 3, it's got to be Murderous Rider. Takes care of Mayhem Devil. In response, Joe can get back to Cauldron Familiar. He can't really shoot Edgar's Cauldron Familiar anymore because of how this worked out. So it'll go upstairs. And Edgar drains for 1.
That was a close decision. I'm not positive on it. The big thing that I think I would have liked to have seen there is maybe waiting until his turn so he could pay a mana for Trail of Crumbs. When he got it back, it's
Right.
basically dealing 1 less damage to Edgar, but you get the card out of it.
And these are some of those, when you talk about if the board gets really complicated, this is the kind of area where I think Joe might lose a bit of mileage if we play a lot of games like this. That said, he can make it about macro things and it won't matter.
How about another Mayhem Devil off the top?
Right, and that should clean up fairly nicely here. We see land 5, it's Fabled Passage. It is another Mayhem Devil
That's a big deal.
into play. Before that's down, Edgar sacrifices the Cauldron Familiar to Witch's Oven, makes a food, sacrifices the food, Trail of Crumbs, and gets Korvold into his hand.
All right, Korvold with Witch's Oven and Cat just runs away with games.
All right. So given that runs away, how does Joe stop this?
Well, he has a Murderous Rider in his hand, so that's a good start.
All right. And it's going to be a pass from Joe. Back over to Edgar we go. Both players know that Edgar picked up a Korvold. With Witch's Oven and a food in play already, Edgar's set to do some damage here with that Korvold. The Fey-Cursed King gets to draw cards and gets counters when things are sacrificed. on Edgar's side we go. He's at the Mayhem Devil disadvantage.
And at this point, it's just sort of a game of trying to figure out if it's worth trying to go over the top with Korvold, if it's going to cost you a bunch of life against a Mayhem Devil and a cat.
Right.
That adds up very quickly.
Your concern would be that Edgar actually gets burned out if he goes that path?
Right.
Tap land and a pass. Feels like he might be building up to something like Casualties of War. At the same time, Edgar had the option to make Murderous Rider, the one that's on an adventure here, and chose against it, so suggesting he's sitting on something.
Right. It may be Murderous Rider. It also wouldn't surprise me if he's in a spot where he just wants to be cracking food and digging.
Okay. And needs that mana for the Trail of Crumbs. We see here another Murderous Rider. That is on Joe's Mayhem Devil. You see Edgar going to fire that one off while Joe's Oven is tapped.
And this is also with its activation on the stack, so Joe doesn't get a chance to respond by bringing the cat back. Unless he cracks that Fabled Passage and then makes a food with the bird, and it's just a whole thing.
So we see Murderous Rider shoots down the Mayhem Devil. Now the food's in play. Now Cauldron Familiar comes back, but there's no pings on any of this. Familiar's back. Joe activates Trail of Crumbs, gets a new card.
And this is the draw to just letting the devil die, is you actually get to get cards off of this sacrifice here.
Yeah, and Edgar's actually getting low on life here, down to 11 from these Cauldron Familiars. Make that 10.
Is it 20 to 10? Does that confirm the next Half-Life game?
Oh, that's nice. Well, Edgar has half the... Oh!
Oh, God. What would I do without you explaining my jokes? I get it. It was not a good joke, but come on.
Well, I just got it now. Beanstalk Giant from Joe. That was picked up off the Trail of Crumbs. Finds a basic swamp. Joe continuing to build up mana here. But right now he is running low on impactful cards. You have to be careful here as Edgar is setting up for a Korvold of his own. Looks like Beanstalk Giant might get hit.
Oof, another Trail of Crumbs.
Yeah, second Trail of Crumbs from Joe. And yeah, with Witch's Oven, Cauldron Familiar, double Trail of Crumbs, Joe, it just isn't going to run out of cards.
Right, and depending on what Edgar chooses to do here, there's even a chance where he could just start doing some wild tricks with Korvold.
So we see another Trail of Crumbs in hand for Edgar and doesn't want to be outdone by Joe's double Trail of Crumbs. Edgar will have a double Trail of Crumbs of his own. At this point, the fact that Joe has made more land drops is starting to feel important.
Right, this is a spot where every missed land drop adds up over time. Just because you ultimately are going to be good at spending all your mana every turn.
With double Trail of Crumbs, it just doesn't feel like you're ever going to run out of cards. So, mana is actually the choke point here.
Correct.
Korvold in play for Edgar. I mean...
Sacrifice trigger on the stack.
1/1 counter, draws a card. This is with the Fabled Passage. I mean, Edgar's just going to draw so many cards at this point, between double Trail of Crumbs, possibility, plus Korvold.
And that's the thing, is this card is very, very similar to just a 5-mana draw 7.
Right, especially in this deck. Is there kind of a card or a... What are you drawing to? Let's assume both players just start drawing
just more
huge
cards.
Amounts of cards.
I know it sounds silly, but there's a point where if you just get more cards, eventually you will end out ahead. This is why Lossett having 2 copies of Trail of Crumbs is a big deal.
I guess the question is, like, is it, like, more Witch's Ovens than your opponent? Because once you do that, you start having more Cauldron Familiars.
Well, eventually you just kind of reach a point where either a Korvold or several Cauldron Familiars or a Mayhem Devil, usually a Korvold or a Mayhem Devil, is
burns them out.
Right, it's just going to do enough to actually slam the door shut.
And to be fair, Edgar still has more Mayhem Devils left in his deck than Joe does right now. So Edgar's stacking here. So he has some Sacrifice triggers, some Trail of Crumbs triggers.
He's prepared for this, you could say.
What a mess. This is, all right, pays 1 for the Trail of Crumbs trigger. Gets a Forest. That goes in his hand. Gets back Cauldron Familiar. That was a long time ago. Now the Sacrifice trigger off Korvold. Draws the card. Believe the Korvold should have grown on that last card draw. Yeah, and Korvold grows. So, outside of Murderous Rider, how can you kill a Korvold?
Well,
it grows really
Casualties
fast.
of War does it, and it is not actually impossible to do with Massacre Girl through some tricks with Cauldron Familiar. So every time something dies with the Massacre Girl, it's actually a separate trigger. So you can stack it and then sack a food and get back your cat, and then let it resolve, and then trigger, and then get back your cat, and so on, to actually just make a ton of triggers with a Massacre Girl. It's unlikely to catch up with an 8/8 from here, but it's not completely out. It's not as far outside of the realm of possibility as you would assume hearing it told like this.
And so now you see Joe reloading the hand here with 2 Trail of Crumbs. Now, something that's going to be a problem for him is that Trail of Crumbs cannot find Casualties of War.
That's true. At this point, he's basically just looking for Murderous Rider.
Yeah, I suppose his own Korvold might be okay. He could fight that fight, or is it too late for that?
No, Korvold could absolutely do it here, but I do think his last card in hand may just be a Murderous Rider.
Okay, well then he has it all ready to go. Draw there was Beanstalk Giant, and you are right, there is Murderous Rider in hand. Korvold looking like an excellent target for the removal spell. Now, at some point, Edgar was discarding to hand size last turn, so there is, there's something here. 3rd Mayhem Devil from Joe. And again, the limit here is his number of lands. Did not leave up Murderous Rider mana, but he can get there with the help of Gilded Goose. Looks like that's what he's going to do. So Gilded Goose makes a mana. That's a food being sacrificed. That's a damage upstairs. Edgar down to 10. Food sacrifice means 2 Trail of Crumbs triggers. Joe going to go ahead not do that, but he will cast the Murderous Rider, taking care of Korvold. There's going to be plenty more triggers for Trail of Crumbs. At this point, you don't actually have to pay for all your Trails of Crumbs because there's just there's too many of them. You can't pay for them all.
The choke point is not the number of cards in your hand.
Right. So Korvold, was trying to be gone, but before that, Edgar's going to do some things. Draw some cards, and now Korvold hit by Murderous Rider.
As one does.
Murderous Rider on an adventure. For Lossett Cauldron Familiar. So now he puts the goose into the oven. The goose is cooked. And so is the Cauldron Familiar.
Oh my gosh. How dare you make me hear that with my own ears? The goose is cooked.
Back to Edgar we go. A 1 Trail of Crumbs and 1 Witch's Oven. That's all that was left at the end of that?
Look, there's still a ton of material on Lossett's side of the battlefield.
Right.
It's not like he doesn't have anything going on. Mayhem Devil is almost a synergy card and hate card at the same time.
Right. Edgar, with all the cards in his hand, not too many lands. I mean, it feels like a Casualties of War has to be the play, and he's drawn enough cards that I somewhat expect him to have one.
It's possible. There's a point where it just might not be good enough.
6 mana. We're going to see the sweeper. We are creature, artifact, enchantment, land.
So this is knocking off Lossette's second black source, and that's incredibly relevant here.
Yeah, we actually saw that last turn. Lossett had to go to the Gilded Goose to cast all his black spells. So all the cards are gone here. Lossett does not bring back Calling Familiar in response, does not want to use that Trail of Crumbs. Edgar just makes a tap land and says go. He's down to 10, but a big cleanup there on the Casualties of War. And this feels like it's a result because Joe was only drawing cards using Trail of Crumbs, but Edgar was drawing cards using Korvold. He got to be live to draw Casualties of War, whereas Joe is not.
There's also a point where Korvold doesn't actually force you to use mana to draw the cards, and that's such a big draw.
Joe rebuilds the Witch's Oven, sacrifices the Cauldron Familiar. We have our third player with a bye going into day 2. This was on our other match. It was Collins Mullen versus Drake Sasser, and it is Drake moving on. He picks up the win and has a bye into tomorrow.
Nice. Oh, there's that Korvold.
Thrashing Bronzodon takes care of the Trail of Crumbs, second one. Allowing Edgar's gone. We believe he has another one in hand as Joe passes back.
At this point, it kind of just feels like the big thing limiting Edgar at this point is his mana. He has so many cards in his hand.
I mean, on Edgar's side, you almost just want to see another Casualties of War, right? If he has one.
Right.
Just to keep grinding it down.
Black, hit the other Trail of Crumbs. Just
hit everything.
Right.
That ended up being the story in Game 1. Can it be the story again in Game 2? Edgar did have the superior card advantage in this game. So if he can get cards to trade, then he will be up in this Jund Mirror.
Trying to figure out if there's some way to get value out of just Mayhem Devils.
You'll see he's going to start on a Mayhem Devil, then another Mayhem Devil. This is pretty scary. Now we see Trail of Crumbs making a food token. Says go.
So this will punish Lossett now pretty heavily if he does any sacrificing.
Yeah, Joe can't do much now.
So what this is really doing is kind of Edgar saying, all right, well, I don't have a great immediate answer to that Korvold that I know is coming. So how much are you willing to pay for greatness, really?
Right. And on top of that, so Joe's in a tough spot because he needs to kill both these Mayhem Devils. But if he doesn't, if Edgar untaps with 2 Mayhem Devils, Joe's going to probably just go to 0.
Right.
You know, I'm not sure exactly how it will happen, but Edgar's going to be bad.
15 is not very much life when all of your sacrifices are worth between 2 and 3 points of damage.
Right, we already know there's a Cauldron Familiar in the graveyard, there's a food in play with a Witch's Oven. It really doesn't take very much for Edgar to get to 15.
Right.
Joe, Beanstalk Giant, sends it on an adventure. But 3 more for Lossett. It's Mayhem Devil of his own. And I don't know. Edgar says, hold on, that's on the stack.
Let me think about that.
Let me see what I want to do. There should be a Cauldron Familiar in that graveyard for Edgar. With a food in play and an untapped Witch's Oven, there is a lot he can do. And we're going to get a chance to see it. So, sacrifices the food token. 2 Mayhem Devil triggers, Joe to 13. Now Cauldron Familiar to play, Joe to 12, Edgar to 9. Witch's Oven sacrifices the familiar. Joe's going to go to 10. Gets a food. And this should just... I think this is going to do it.
Yeah,
Okay.
This is going to be a really tough spot for Lossett to navigate through.
Mayhem Devil resolves. And now Edgar, he's hoping to end the game this turn, send himself into day 2. 2 Mayhem Devils and a Witch's Oven feels like it should be enough. He untaps with a full grip. And I think here's another Witch's Oven about to join on in.
Yeah, this is going to be it. If he has a Korvold, that does it.
5 mana here from Edgar.
That's just another sacrifice.
Right, he has a Korvold, but does he even need it? Unclear. He'll go for it, though. Here is Korvold. Into play. Sacrifices the food. Gets a counter. Draws a card. Deals 2 damage.
So we have
All right, so
3
Joe,
Mayhem Devil triggers, a Trail of Crumbs trigger, a Korvold trigger, and this cat activation under all of that.
All right, so Trail, Korvold. I don't know that we're going to get to all of these. I don't think we're going to get the stack to clear before this ends. There's too much, but we're going to try to do it. So these dice are counters of worth of damage from Joe's. This is damage that Mayhem Devils are throwing around, I believe. This is nice. This is. I think Joe's dead. Okay, that's where this is going to end up.
I am under the impression that Joe is going to end up at 0 life. Somehow.
It's one of those things where you look at your opponent and be like, please make this stop. Both could, like, you're an Edgar spot. You're like, I know it's good for me, but can we please not? So, now with that sacrifice, Joe to 8, Colin Freeler comes back, Joe to 7, Edgar to 10. Witch's Oven sacrifices the familiar, 2 more damage. Joe goes to 5. Joe gets another trigger. He puts it on Edgar's Mayhem Devil. There's another Trail of Crumbs trigger, another Korvold trigger. I don't know that Edgar cares.
Yeah, at the point where you didn't activate the first Trail of Crumbs, it's hard to imagine you're activating the second one.
He's going to take the Korvolds because those seem pretty free. But now the food into play, Joe is at 5. And this should do it, right? There's more than 5 damage left here with these Witches, Ovens, and Cats.
Right. Now we just enter territory where Edgar just responds to all the triggers.
Sacrifice here, 2 more damage. Upstairs, now Joe puts a 3rd point of damage on the Mayhem Devil, and Edgar, though he could start responding to this, says, I don't need to. Joe, you take 2, you're at 3, I draw the card. Here's another Mayhem Devil. There are many things on the board Edgar can sacrifice. It's the end of the tournament, so Joe's going to make him do it, so let's go. We see Colin Familiar, 2 damage upstairs. Joe goes to 1. Familiar enters the battlefield, and Joe goes to 0, and that is going to be the round. It is 2-0.